Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerald Bolden. I'm the Wonders Program Director at Chevy Chase Extended Day. I want to share with you some of additional resources that we do at Wonders at Chevy Chase that the children look forward to. One of them is our Wayside School series that we read every Wednesday. I'm going to be reading 2 chapters each day and providing with you about 10 minutes worth of reading that we do with the children. The first chapter from Wayside School is Falling Down. It's called A Package for Mrs. Jules. Louis, the yard teacher, frowned. The schoolyard was a mess. There were pencils and pieces of paper everywhere. How'd all this junk get here? He wondered. Well, I'm not going to pick it up. It wasn't his job to pick up garbage. He was just supposed to pass out the playground balls during lunch and recess, and also make sure the kids didn't hurt each other. He sighed, then he changed his mind and he started to clean up the garbage. He loved all the children at Wayside School and he didn't want them playing on a dirty playground. As he was picking up the pencils and pieces of paper, a large truck drove into the parking lot. It honked its horn twice, then twice more. Louis ran to the truck. "Quiet," he whispered. "Children are trying to learn in there." He pointed at the school. A short man with big, bushy hair stepped out of the truck. "I have a package for somebody named Mrs. Jules." "I'll take it," said Louis. "Are you Mrs. Jules?" asked the man. "No," said Louis. "I have to give it to Mrs. Jules," said the man. Louis thought for a moment. He didn't want the man disturbing the children. He knew how much they hated to be interrupted when they were working. "I'm Mrs. Jules," said Louis. "But you just said you weren't Mrs. Jules," said the man. "I changed my mind," said Louis. The man got the package out of the back of the truck and gave it to Louis. "Here you go, Mrs. Jules," he said. "Ugh!" Louis grunted. It was a very heavy package. The word fragile was printed on every side. He had to be careful not to drop it. The package was so big, Louis couldn't see where he was going. Fortunately, he knew the way to Mrs. Jules' class by heart. It was straight up. Wayside School was 30 stories high with only one room on each story. Mrs. Jules' class was at the very top. It was Louis's favorite class. He pushed through the door to the school, then started up the stairs. There was no elevator. There were stairs that led down to the basement, but nobody ever went down there. The box was pressed against Louis's face, squishing his nose. Even so, when he reached the 15th floor, he could smell the cafeteria manager, Mrs. Mushet, cooking in the cafeteria. It smelled like she was making mushrooms. Maybe on my way back, I'll stop by Miss Mush's room and get some mushrooms, he thought. He didn't want Miss Mush's mushrooms because they were her specialty. He didn't want to miss out on it. He huffed and groaned and continued up the stairs. His arms and legs were very sore, but he did not want to rest. The package might be very important, and he thought, "I have to get it to Mrs. Jules right away." He stepped easily from the 18th story to the 20th story. There was no 19th story. Mrs. Zarvis taught the class on the 19th story. There was no Miss Zarvis. At last, he struggled to the final step to the 30th story. He knocked on Mrs. Jules' door with his head. When Mrs. Jules was in the middle of teaching her class about gravity, she heard the knock. "Come in," she called. "I can't open the door," Louis gasped. "My hands are full and I have a package for you." Mrs. Jules faced the class. "Who wants to open the door for Louis?" All the children raised their hands. They loved to be interrupted when they were working. "Oh dear, how shall I choose?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I have to be fair about this. I know. We'll have a spelling bee, and the winner will get to open the door." Louis knocked his head against the door again. "It's heavy," he complained, "and I'm very tired." "Just a second," Mrs. Jules called back. "Allison, the first words for you is heavy." "Heavy," said Allison. "Heavy. Heavy," said Allison. "Very good. Jason, you're next," said Mrs. Jules. "The word is tired." "Tired," said Jason. Sleepy. "Tired," said Jason. Louis felt the package slipping from his sweaty fingers. He shifted his weight to get a better grip. The corners of the box dug into the sides of his arms. He felt his hands going numb. Actually, He didn't even feel them go numb. Jenny, your word is package, said Mrs. Jules. Package, said Jenny. B-O-X. Package. Excellent, said Mrs. Jules. Louis felt like he was getting ready to faint. At last, John opened the door. I won the spelling bee, Louis, he said. Very good, John, muttered Louis. Aren't you going to shake my hand? Asked John. Louis shifted the box to one arm and quickly shook John's hand, then grabbed the box again, and he staggered into the classroom. Where do you want it, Mrs. Jules? He asked. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. What is it? I don't know, said Louis. I have to put it down someplace so you can open it. But how can I tell you where to put it until I know what's in it? Asked Mrs. Jules. You might put it in the wrong place. So Louis held the box as Mrs. Jules stood on a chair next to him and tore open the top. His legs started to wobble beneath him. It's a computer, said Mrs. Jules. All the children started to boo. What's the matter? Asked Louis. I thought everyone loved computers. We don't want it, Louis, said Eric Bacon. Take it back, Jack, said Terrence. Get that piece of junk out of here, said Mauricia. Now, don't be that way, said Mrs. Jules. The computer will help us learn. It's a lot quicker than a pencil and a paper. But the quicker we learn, the more work we have to do, complained Todd. You may set it over there on the counter, Louis, said Mrs. Jules. Louis set the computer on the counter next to Sherry's desk. Then he collapsed onto the floor. Now watch closely, said Mrs. Jules. Everyone gathered around the new computer. It had a full-color monitor and a 2-disc drive. Mrs. Jules then proceeded to push the computer out the window. They all watched it fall and smash against the sidewalk. See, said Mrs. Jules, that's gravity. Oh, now I get it, said Joe. Thank you, Louis, said Mrs. Jules. I've been trying to teach them about gravity all morning. We've been using pencils and pieces of paper, but the computer was a lot quicker. Chapter 2 is called Mark Miller. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. I would like for you, class, to meet Mark Miller. He and his family just moved here all the way from Macedonia. All the children stared at the new kid in class. He stood in front of the room. His knees were shaking. He hated standing in front of the class. It was as Mrs. Jules had brought him in for show and tell. He felt like some kind of weirdo. He just wanted to sit at a desk and be like everybody else. But worst of all, his name wasn't Mark Miller. His real name was Benjamin Nushmut, and he had moved from Helmpton to Macedonia. But he was too scared to mention that to Mrs. Jules. He was afraid to correct a teacher. Why don't you tell the class a little bit about yourself, Mark? Suggested Mrs. Jules. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wished he really was Mark Miller. Mark Miller wouldn't be scared, he thought. He probably would have lots to say. Everyone would like Mark Miller. Nobody would think Mark Miller was weird. Well, I guess we better find a place for you to sit, said Mrs. Jules. She put him at the empty desk between Todd and Bebe. Hi, Mark, said Todd. I'm Todd. You'll like Mrs. Jules. She's the nicest teacher in the school. Todd, no talking, said Mrs. Jules. Now go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Hi, Mark, said Bebe. I'm Bebe Gunn. Hi, Benjamin said quietly. He decided he would have to tell Mrs. Jules his real name at recess. He cringed. He didn't know why, but for some reason, he had trouble saying his own name. And what's your name, little boy? An adult would ask him. Benjamin Nushmut, he would answer. What? Benjamin Nushmut. What? Benjamin Nushmut. What? Benjamin Nushmut. What? Benjamin Nushmut. Oh, nice to meet you, Benjamin. He never knew what was that made that person suddenly understand him. Well, when the bell rang for recess, everyone charged out the room. Benjamin slowly walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. Somehow, he had to tell her. Mrs. Jules was sorting papers. Oh, hello, Mark. How are you enjoying the class so far? Fine, said Benjamin. Good. I'm glad to hear that, said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shrugged, then walked out of the room. If I had told her my name, she would have thought I was weird for not telling her sooner, he had realized. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. Recess was only 10 minutes long. It didn't seem worth it to go all the way down and then come all the way back up. He didn't have any friends down there anyway. He had never been more unhappy in his whole life. He sat on the top step. "Mark Miller," he said out loud. It was an easy name to say. Mark Miller probably would have made a lot of friends by now. Suddenly, he heard a low rumble. The stairs began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. "Oh my goodness, this whole school's going to fall down," he thought. He put his head between his knees. The rumbling got worse. "Oh my goodness, this is it. Something's going to happen. And no one's going to know who I am," he worried. "They're going to think I'm the new kid, Mark Miller, the weirdo." But it wasn't an earthquake. It was just all the kids running back up the stairs after recess. "Hey, Mark, why are you sitting here?" asked Dee Dee. "You look funny," said Ron. Benjamin looked up. "How come you weren't at recess?" asked Jason. "We looked everywhere for you." "Couldn't you find the playground?" asked Calvin. "It's just straight down," said BB. "You couldn't miss it." "But don't go in the basement," warned Sherry. "Whatever you do, don't go in the basement." "We'll go to recess together after lunch," said Todd. "That way you won't get lost the next time." Benjamin smiled. He was glad. Everyone seemed to like him, or at least they liked Mark Miller. He wondered if they would really like Benjamin Nushmut too. "The bell has rung," said Mrs. Jules, standing in the doorway. "Now everyone please come inside." She made Todd put a check next to his name on the board for being late. Mrs. Jules handed a stack of worksheets to Damon and asked him to pass them out to the rest of the class. Benjamin looked at his worksheet. At the top right corner, there was a place to put his name. He didn't know which name to put, Mark Miller or Benjamin Nushmut. He left it blank and started working on the first problem. Louis, the yard teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. "Benjamin forgot his lunch," he said. "His mother just brought it." "Who?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Benjamin," said Louis. "There's no Benjamin in my class," said Mrs. Jules. "Are you sure?" asked Louis. "It looks like a good lunch." "I know the names of the children in my class," said Mrs. Jules. "Well, I'll just leave it here until I figure this out," said Louis, and he left the lunch on Mrs. Jules' desk and walked out of the room. Benjamin frowned. He looked at the white paper sack on Mrs. Jules' desk. He couldn't tell Mrs. Jules' real name now. She'd think he was just making it up so he could get a free lunch. He wrote Mark Miller on the top of his worksheet. But one of these days, he knew he'd have to tell her his real name. Tomorrow, we'll be reading chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is BB's baby brother, and chapter 4 is homework. Have a great rest of the day.